in this last hour of the last day, we have an exciting ending of the program, so to speak. First, we have the supporting note by the State Secretary, Martina Hirayama. Welcome from all of us. And then at 5:10, we have the panel with various panelists. We'll introduce them at that time. So the floor is yours, Ms. Hirayama.
Thank you very much, Professor Salate, researchers, ladies and gentlemen. We don't know 1/1,000,000 of 1% about anything. This is a quote from Thomas Edison, the great American inventor and entrepreneur in electricity and electrical engineering. When he said this at the turn of the 20th century, it's not quite clear whether he was being pessimistic or simply realistic. I tend to think the latter, and I believe what he said is still relatively true to this day. There have been incredible advances in science and research over the past few centuries. The body of knowledge available to us has increased exponentially and very often for the good of humanity. And yet COVID-19 has brought us face to face with reality. The pandemic has shown how vulnerable we are as individuals and also how vulnerable we are as global community, despite all our advanced knowledge and skills. In this sense, it is clear we are always going to need far more knowledge for future challenges. And right now, as a matter of urgency, far more knowledge to face this pandemic. As much as vaccination is our priority today, so too must be continued research. The federal government is and always has been aware of this role as the main public sponsor of basic research. This is why we have consistently increased funding for research over the past 20 years. The bulk of these funds are used on a bottom-up basis. The Swiss National Science Foundation is mandated to fund projects in all fields of science, provided they are of truly high quality. Supporting independent basic research aimed primarily at widening our knowledge is therefore the underlying principle of the federal government's research policy. In comparison, applied research funded by the federal government plays a smaller role, but one that is also very important. At the Swiss National Science Foundation, we have two types of instruments for this. First, there are the National Centers of Competency Research, or NCCRs. These form the backbone of the Swiss research landscape. They consolidate the generation of knowledge in strategically important subject areas based at one or more home institutions. The NCCRs run for a maximum of 12 years and then generally become independent institutions. The other funding instruments for applied research, the National Research Programs, or NRPs, are designed to be more short-term. Given the urgency of the current situation, an NRP is well suited for dealing with the many unanswered questions we have about COVID-19, so we can acquire the knowledge we need to act as quickly as possible. This is why the Federal Council launched NRP 78 last spring with a budget of 20 million Swiss francs, with the first program conference already possible today, so that's really quick. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone involved in this important NRP for outstanding commitment. We are all aware that the government, on behalf of the society, is entitled to expect results from the research it funds. But we also know that research, by its very nature, is an inherently unpredictable business. With this in mind, NRP 78 COVID-19 should be seen as both a journey and the destination. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that you are doing your utmost along this difficult journey. I believe in the value of close national and international networking among stakeholders and an interdisciplinary approach. The NRP COVID-19 focuses explicitly on the need for biomedical and clinical knowledge. But as is increasingly clear, the challenges raised by the pandemic are extremely complex. With this in mind, another NRP called COVID-19 in Society was launched just yesterday. Here, the focus is on how the pandemic is likely to affect the economy, society, and politics. This new NRP 80 supplements NRP 78 COVID-19. Taken together, the two programs will ensure we will very soon know a few millions or perhaps even a few hundreds more about things and prove Edison wrong. I'm confident that we will certainly know much more about COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you every success on this challenging journey. Thank you very much for your efforts and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. State Secretary, and thank you for the continued support, of course, for the research that everyone's doing here. Much appreciated. Good. Now we come to the last part of the panel, of the event, which is the panel. And since I was asked to be on the panel, I don't think it should be me introducing the panelists, so I'm gonna hand over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor to introduce you to our panelists for the final discussion about the role of science as support of politics versus the role of politics as a support for research. On the panel is Christine Kopp. She is head of the COVID-19 task force in the Federal Office of Public Health. Marina Garrobbio, Council of States of the Canton of Ticino and member of the Social Security and Health Committee of the Council of States. Samia Hurst, bioethics professor and vice president of the Swiss Scientific Task Force. Lucas Engelberger, president of the Conference of the Health Directors or Ministers of the Cantons, and Marcel Salaté, professor of epidemiology. When looking back to the early times of the pandemics, Ticino was the canton that was very much concerned. Mrs. Garrobbio, when you look back at this time, what were your first reactions? What did you feel? What was to do? And how could you gather scientific information at that early time? Do you remember? It's a long time ago. You are on mute. You should unmute your microphone. Still?
Excuse me, I have some problem today.
No problem.
It's okay now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thank you to invited me. And perhaps I want to say something about me. I am a member of the Health and Security Committee of the Parliament, but I am a member of the Research and Education Committee too. I think it is important for the discussion that we will do today.
Mm-hmm.
You ask me what I remember from the fourth wave in my canton. Yes, if you say my canton was the fourth canton to be affected by the coronavirus epidemic. And I have to say that in the fourth week, we can't hide it. The rest of Switzerland found it hard to understand why we had taken more restrictive measures than the rest of the country. It was only later, when the Federal Council decided on the middle of March 2020 to introduce a lockdown, that the rest of Switzerland began to understand the seriousness of the situation. And if I say we have taken in the fourth wave more restrictive measures than the rest of the Switzerland, which were also accepted by the population, given the high number of infection and the proximity to Italy. And for Canton Ticino, it was very important to obtain the support of the Confederation and the so-called crisis window, meaning that Ticino was also entitled to economic aid despite the state of emergency at national level. If I say this, because it was important to understand a difference between the south part of Switzerland, Canton Ticino, and the rest of Switzerland, and it was difficult the fourth week to speak, to have a discussion with the rest of Switzerland. On the other part, you asked me what was the meaning of science and scientists. They were very, very important for the population of Ticino to accept the measure and to accept restrictive measures too.
So in the handling of the pandemic, there are huge differences between the cantons. Lukas Engelberger, in your coordination function as president of the Conference of Health Directors, how do you perceive this today? Is it still a problem, or did the cantons adjust to each other's? How do you see it today?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this federalist aspect of crisis handling. I think it's an important one. In Switzerland, being a federalist country by its political DNA, so I think it's important to reflect on federalism in the crisis. I think nowadays there is a wide understanding in all of the cantons that the pandemic is not striking us all the same way at the same time. So you have first mentioned the special situation in Ticino at the very beginning. Then the first wave mainly affected the western and southern part of the country, while many of the eastern and central cantons weren't hardly affected by it. And then the second wave was different. It affected all of the country, and since then we all realized, okay, every canton can be at the focus, at the center of this tornado anytime. So currently it's canton of Uri. By far, if we look at the infection rate, by far canton of Uri has the most cases, but it can completely change. I'm the healthcare responsible for the canton of Basel-Stadt. We have been at the top of this list of caseload, and we have been the canton with the least infections in these 2 weeks incidence measures. So it can go very quickly, and I think everybody has realized that in the meantime, and is very careful to question measures of other cantons to fight the pandemic. And currently, I think we don't have many discussions amongst the cantons on which is the better stance to take, or whether measures should be stronger or should be released quicker. I think we're currently quite in line with the Federal Council. Of course, you still have tendencies both ways, but I think currently there is quite some broad understanding that it's still a special situation, also in legal terms. That's the lead for the main measures, and also for fading them out is with the Confederation. And so I don't see very difficult discussions on that between the cantons.
Christine Kopp, as a national crisis manager, you're standing in a way on the other side, and a lot of people are speaking about 26 strategies to fight a pandemic in Switzerland. Is this famous Swiss federalism reaching its limits with when fighting a pandemic? How do you perceive this?
Thank you, Mark, and good evening, everybody, for this round. I would simply answer we're standing on the same side. I'm very convinced, and that's really something I felt in this pandemic, we all have to find together and to fight together. And there is, to say it maybe a bit too simple, there is one target that we have, that's the virus and the pandemic. And I absolutely agree with Mr. Engelberger that we are getting along very well, the cantons and the Confederation. And I think that's the only way to get along. I'm a convinced federalist, even in the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic needs special measures, and we have to be quicker. We have to have more possibilities to decide quickly. But I see that still in this situation, the cantonal diversity also provides room for many new solutions, for a lot of innovation. And maybe contrary to what my role is at the Confederation and contrary to what we often hear in discussions, I'm very convinced that federalism will also carry us through the pandemic, as long as we are willing to keep on discussing together and to really join forces to find the best solutions. Thank you.
Keep on discussing together. That brings me to the Scientific Task Force. Samia Hurst, thank you for being with us. You are Vice President of the Scientific Task Force, which is a committee with a huge number of members. Could you explain us how you perceive it, the role of the task force, how it works, maybe also compared to other countries, because not every country has this system with this scientific advisory boards. Other countries, they have more kind of a one master's voice, if I dare telling like this. What are the advantages of such a big scientific task force? Or maybe also the disadvantages?
So first, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very aware also of the important role that the SNF has played in participating in the setup of the task force, along with the academies, the ETH and Swiss universities. So basically all the institutions of the Swiss scientific community. The role of a task force such as ours is very straightforward in theory, and in practice, like everything, it is a little more complex. In theory, the point is to provide decision makers with results of scientific knowledge as much as possible in real time and across the board. And for this reason, it's actually a very great advantage to be many and to be many disciplines. And this is one of the things for which Switzerland has actually done quite well, because we have managed to recruit very fast many people out of all the relevant disciplines. In some other countries, the more centrally visible disciplines to face a pandemic were recruited, mostly virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists. In Switzerland, it was recognized from the beginning that a pandemic is a systemic stress test for the entire society, that epidemics threaten our lives in the global sense, not just our physical lives, but our mental health, our identities, our relationships to one another, our social groups. And so not only the life sciences and the medical disciplines, but economics and ethical and social issues were on board from the beginning. Another aspect is that it was recruited in a very decentralized manner. Basically, the different institutions contacted people who contacted people, and then we got back to the institutions. For example, I chair the Ethical, Legal and Social Issues group within the Swiss Science Task Force. And every question, except if it's really very urgent, every question that we address gets sent to Division 1 of the Swiss National Science Foundation. And this gets distributed then to all researchers who work with public funding on any related topic that have something to say. So I sometimes meet people in shared documents whom I did not know exist, because they are providing important input on a question I've asked without knowing who to ask, but the Swiss system works in a way to find them. And in this interdisciplinary and decentralized way, we have managed to have a great deal of collective intelligence to provide knowledge to decision makers as much as possible in real time. This is not possible if you have just one person, because that one person cannot have the same group intelligence as a large group does.
There are huge debates about the role of the scientific task force, and there were some people leaving the task force. One of them is Marcel Salate. What were the reasons for you to leave the official advisory board? Do you feel more free with your own newly founded organization to express your opinion and your expertise? Or what are the advantages to be out of such an official organization?
Well, I thought less Zoom meetings, but it turns out I have now more Zoom meetings. No, but more seriously, I have never felt constrained in the expression itself, and I left the task force on extremely good terms. But one of the observations I made in the last years are everything at the end of the day is a question of resource allocation, and so is pandemic fighting a pandemic. And I think so will be any crisis we face, whether reactively or proactively. And it turns out that when it comes to scientific decision making and of implementation of sort of technology at the cutting edge level, there's actually no organization that really can defend those interests. Because the scientific institutions are not set up to do that. They're set up to do research and teach, and other technological institutions are, I mean, industry is of course looking also for itself, as it should. So there is actually no institution that would do that, and that's what I wanted to do with colleagues, to make sure we have such an organization in Switzerland. And it would just have been confusing if I had stayed in the task force and did that same thing. And I also think for organizations, it's always good if there's a bit of a turnaround of faces and views.
So with this public explanation of the scientific task force members, there's always a danger of being politicized, or that researchers become lobbyists. So maybe a question to all of you: how do you perceive that? Do you see a risk that a scientist or researchers could, in a way, misuse their function, their public function they receive by the role in these task forces?
Who is the question for?
You can all answer to it. Maybe more first, more the politicians. Mrs. Caropio, do you have discussions with researchers? Do you see that problem, or is it just you receive information from them?
I think that is very, very important to have a dialogue between scientists and politics. And for this reason, I thank you to invite me, because I'm worried to err in the discussion now that there is no institution that defend the job of scientists or the job of task force in this case. I think there are two or three key points. First, that science is important for politicians to take decisions. Secondly, we need a balance between science, public health, and economy. It was a big discussion about this, but we have to say we can protect both health and economy at the same time. We don't have to oppose them. It's also clear that we need the support of the population. If we don't have a balance, we won't have this support. And at the third point is that we need a strong fiscal support and economic aid that accompany the health restrictive measure. But this is what we have to do, and we have to understand the reality is others. And I don't know if there is a use from scientists, from the politician, but what I see, it is the contrary. We need politicians and policy that respect scientific evidence. And I am worried that some politicians criticize scientists in order to gain political advantage. I think this is the big problem at the moment.
Christine Kopp, how do you see it with authorities or the federal chancellor? does he also risk to get instrumentalized by scientists, or the other way around, if he ignores the advice of the task forces? How do you see this topic in the federal office?
Thank you. And I think Lukas Engelberger wanted to talk, but maybe I answer the question and then pass on the word. Let me answer from my personal perspective. I think it was extremely helpful that the scientists who have to say something about dealing with the pandemic found together in this more formal way of the Science Task Force. In the first wave, still working at the Swiss Red Cross, I realized how quickly in that situation people got together who were looking for solutions. Amongst them, quite a lot of the members of the what now is the Science Task Force. And it was extremely helpful to know that this group of scientists also have a formal status, can be really accessed by the government, and that's now in my role in the federal office. That gives us the legitimation to talk to the Science Task Force. We have very direct ways of asking questions and get the best answers possible. I also think it's an extreme privilege to have so many really leading scientists who help us answer the questions that come up every day. So I think this is just a great way of getting this support and getting this incredible knowledge that's in our universities, in the ETH and so on. So I don't really think that it's a question of one overtaking the other and so on, but I feel that both or all parties really respect their roles. We are happy to have the scientific evidence, to have the support of science, and I never had the feeling that the scientists don't accept the fact that it's the politicians who make the decisions when it comes down to the final decision. So I think it's a good complement, and the rules are that each party has to stay to its role. And I would be very curious also to hear, if I may pass on the word from Mr. Engelberger, who is on really the political level, I'm the administration, how you perceive it.
Thank you very much. Yes, so then I take over here, and I first of all would like to join Mrs. Kopp in thanking the members of the task force and of the scientific community in a broader sense for their work. I share this experience. It's very efficient to get into contact with members of the task force. I have had many phone calls with the president of the task force, although the task force is basically mandated by the federal government, not by the cantons, but we have access also to discuss with the members, and this is really highly appreciated. And it's very important that also scientists have a platform in this political process to bring in the scientific evidence and the advice. But I think it's also important to see this in a broader perspective. I think this COVID-19 pandemic probably is the single topic that has been the most debated, and it's probably the largest scientific debate ever, because it's global, it's universal, it's interdisciplinary, and it's happening in all transparency throughout the globe over social media. And so I think that's it's probably a fundamental change for the scientists in their role, 10 years ago or 20 years ago with SARS-1, there were epidemiologists explaining to the public what the facts are of science, or what the findings of science are. And nowadays this is globally debated, and it's not just one scientific explanation, but it's dozens of theories and approaches. And so I think this is far more democratic and public, and it's collective learning throughout the globe. And I think that's highly interesting, of course, from a scientific and political point of view. But it's very difficult for the public, because of course it's not everybody is trusting the same persons or theories, and that makes the whole thing very, very complex. And again, back to the task force, then it helps if it becomes clear who are the formal advisors of the federal government, and so this also comes with some authority, and makes that process more transparent. And that does not mean that the government has to follow the advice that it gets from the task force, but the process has made sure that there is the possibility for the scientists to give their advice. And I think that's very good also to strengthen the authority of the decisions then that have to be taken by the politicians.
So Mia Hurst, if we have those two poles of, on one hand, the scientific evidence, on the other hand, the more political or societal interests, can ethics be the balance between the two poles? Maybe also regarding the discussion about the Covet Certificate right now, actually.
So ethics is about values and what makes them applicable, what makes them right, and what makes something that is right or wrong. So it's an area. It's the area that I teach to medical students in my regular life, which I still do, and it's an area where we are accustomed to explaining how conflicting values interact. And so it is a useful tool to understand where trade-offs exist, and to understand also why, even though facts can be very clear and can seem to point to very obvious conclusions, there are still sometimes different decisions that can be made based on the same facts. So I would like to very much agree with what has been said before. It's not really about science versus other things being society or economics or even, oh my goodness, politics. These are not in opposition. Science is about knowing as much as possible, and about knowing what we know and knowing what we do not know. This is a crucial component of any decision, but it is just a component. Surely we do not want authorities to make decisions in the ignorance of known facts. But it doesn't mean that facts are the only component of a decision. There are trade-offs involved. There are different values that different people will place different priorities on, and that is the area that I like to study and teach students. So ethics is not the arbiter. Ethics is the explainer of where the arbitration is required. But then there still needs to be an arbiter, and that is usually whoever has the responsibility and accountability for the decision in the first place. So when we are talking about decisions that are in the hands of governments, then they are the ones who are responsible, and yes, also accountable for the decisions which they make based on all these components.
So if we take the example of the Covet Certificate, which is to come soon, hopefully soon, there are a lot of ethical aspects involved. Marcel Salaté, you mentioned in some media interviews that you are worried about this aspect a bit. What are your concerns about the Covet Certificate?
Well, the concerns are about the use of such certificates and the buildup of infrastructure around it that is sometimes hard/impossible to take down again, right? Digital infrastructure, this is maybe sometimes a little bit forgotten, but because you somehow can't touch it. But like any other infrastructure, you know, once you build roads, they're there, and typically they don't just go away. And it's the same with digital infrastructure. This is a digital infrastructure where all of a sudden, right, health attributes tell me I can enter this venue or I cannot. And, you know, I'm not a priori saying this is not something we should touch at all. But I think before we go down that path, we should have really deep discussions about what we're doing here and what the consequences are. Certainly, I think when it comes to tests, I personally have relatively few issues. I mean, that's something we've established over a long time. But, you know, making a decision to let something onto a concert based on whether they had the infection or not, I mean, given what we now know about the science, or what we don't know about the science, about how long immunity lasts and so on, I think these are very tricky paths to go down on, only to be used in really, really clear situations. And as I've kept saying, to me, the clear situation is in the situation where we don't make the rules, which is abroad, right? So that's why I support the certificate, so we can give the Swiss population the ability to travel again, because outside rules we don't influence, but inside the country we make the rules. And I just wish we tread very carefully when making those rules for that new type of infrastructure.
Samia Hurst.
Yeah, so one useful exercise of the imagination to think about how to deal with COVID-19 certificates within our country is to project ourselves at a time when the pandemic is clearly past. So I'm not going to go out on a limb too much, but say in 5 or 10 years, I hope it will be long past. But what would a COVID-19 certificate be acceptable for then? Once we have enough collective immunity so that we do not have flare-ups that threaten the health system anymore, once everyone who wants a chance to be vaccinated has had it, at that time, probably we will not accept a COVID-19 certificate for things for which we do not accept an obligation to be vaccinated in our ordinary lives today. So travel to certain destinations would clearly be on the list, right? It will probably still be necessary for travel to some countries. And then certain very specific professional activities, especially when you are entrusted with vulnerable persons who perhaps cannot be vaccinated or with whom vaccination doesn't work. But beyond that, it's unlikely that we will still accept that there is a requirement for a COVID-19 certificate in ordinary life. And so we are talking indeed about something that has to be thought of as temporary. I completely agree with Marcel Salaté. It has to be thought of as temporary. And so this has to be thought of like that from the beginning. Because if we do not think of it as temporary from the beginning, the risk does indeed exist that it would then simply last. And then for this temporary time span, there are a few clear limits. Some goods and rights are essential and must be accessible to everyone. Some activities can be very easily made safe for everyone, and it's clearly preferable that they be made so rather than accessible only for those who have a COVID-19 certificate. And then it is clearly preferable to axe the thing on testing and perhaps exempt from testing those who have a vaccine or acquired immunity, rather than focusing it on vaccination status and then adding other things. Because testing, again, is something that has entered our daily lives. It is something that shows contagiousness rather than a choice regarding vaccination. It is less susceptible to stigmatization. It is more temporary. And so there are a few lines beyond which I believe we should not go. There is also a position of the National Ethics Commission on this topic that takes a similar stance.
Christine Kopp, you wanted to.
Thank you. I'm looking at the question a bit from another side. We are all very much limited in what we can do in everyday life at the moment. We can't go to concerts or barely and so on. And I believe that it's really only legitimate to keep up these limits as long as it's really, in terms of prevention of transmission, justified. So just to take it from a very personal point of view, my mother has been vaccinated now, I'm not vaccinated. Why should I not let her go to a concert, travel abroad, or whatever? So that's my view on the certificate. I think it's crucial that we have the three aspects of testing, vaccination, and having passed through the disease. But I would not want anyone who does not need to keep up the limits that we are living through right now. And for that, I think the certificate really makes sense. And I'm very with you, Samia, that it has to be timely limited. It's nothing that we should keep up for the next 5 or 10 years. And of course, you're very right, Marcel, that any system that's established always has the tendency to stay. And that's a danger we have to keep an eye and really also probably on a legal level set the limit to. But I'm hoping for the certificate to work and let us all enjoy some liberties as soon as possible. Thank you.
If I may add, I have to say that thinking about these COVID-19 certificates, I personally find it very reassuring to be sitting in a country like Switzerland rather than some other countries that I'm not going to name, because, for example, we have no legal limitation on private businesses limiting access to their premises based on vaccination status. So in theory, grocery stores could say from now on, if you're not vaccinated, you cannot come and buy food. But it is not something that anybody has very realistic concerns could happen, right? And so although it is entirely legal, and we could legally have a situation where people could not purchase subsistence food if they are not vaccinated, I have not met anyone who actually believes that this could happen. And this is a very reassuring element.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open up the panel to the research community. Are there any questions to our panelists?
Mark, while we wait, can I quickly make a response to that, slightly provocative? I agree with Samia, right? You know, we're all happy to live in Switzerland, and you know, there's no concerns until there are.
Yes.
I don't know, right, how many people have been surprised by the handling or by the unpreparedness of Switzerland in early 2020. When this pandemic hit, and they said, well, you know, but in Switzerland, this would never happen, right? We are prepared. And so I hear you, and I have the same sort of fundamental trust in my compatriots, but I would also just remind us, right, that this doesn't just fall from the sky and it's just somehow magically in the air in Switzerland, but that we really have to work for it.
Yeah, and we mustn't forget that access to tests and access to vaccination is not as equally distributed as we would like it to be. And it is not out of the question in practice that some private businesses might want to close their doors to people they view as undesirable and do it based on vaccination or the lack of a test. So in the concern to give access, especially to basic services to everyone, it's not excluded that some legislative work may be in order. And that was actually part of the recommendations of the National Ethics Commission for these situations where barring people based on vaccination status is not forbidden and therefore is allowed. And that might be problematic in some instances.
So talking about vaccination, access to vaccination, vaccination plans, I think there are a lot of topics around that on the national level, but also on the international plan. Mrs. Garobio, what is your opinion about these discussions? Are we privileged in Switzerland to have access to vaccinations? How do we assure that other countries also get better access to vaccinations? How do you see it in your commission and as a member of the parliament?
This is a very important discussion. We see what is happening now, not only with vaccination, but to access to health and testing and health measure in India, for example, but other countries too. And it is important that Switzerland participate to international projects like COVAX to promote equitable access to vaccine, but this is not enough. And I think we have to do greater efforts, and the political will of all nations are needed to defeat the pandemic and emerge from the crisis together. We need a global approach to stop virus. It's a pandemic, we speak of a pandemic. And I think that it is important to have a multilateral policy of fair distribution of vaccine in the world and to support other countries. And we are not at this level. There is this project, COVAX, I say it, but I think we have to act together. And when I speak from we, Switzerland with other rich country, we cannot forget that some countries are in very difficulty at the moment. India is an important example. What is happening? Vaccine is one, access to medicament is the other, to testing, to health measure. And we can only do it with a multilateral policy. It's very important at the moment. And sometimes we see nationalism in vaccine access or medicament access, and we have to change this approach.
Mr. Engelberger, so many Swiss citizens seem to not to want being vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccinations. Would it be a solution just to donate the AstraZeneca vaccinations to other countries?
Well, usually we get other demands. We usually get the demands to bring in more vaccines to our people rather than the question whether we could donate. Now, AstraZeneca hasn't been authorized by Swissmedic yet, so we don't know whether it's going to be available here. And I think certainly we should not donate products that haven't been authorized for use in Switzerland. So because that would mean that we would apply different standards. But I take it that you were not pointing to this, but rather to a situation where it would be authorized. It can be authorized, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 2 weeks, maybe it's never the case. But let's assume it's been authorized and available in Switzerland. Then we will have to see whether it's accepted, people want it or not. Personally, I tend to think that there will be demand for that vaccine as well. Probably not the same level of acceptance and trust that we now see in the mRNA vaccines, but still demand for it within that group. That might be limited by Swissmedic or ECIF then in their recommendations. And so we simply should offer that for those who want it. I guess that will be people in good health condition who are impatient because of maybe professional reasons, need to travel, etc. And so I think that we then should offer it to the Swiss inhabitants, and in case then it's left, yes, of course we should then donate. I mean, generally speaking, there was this debate also about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's one of the very few topics where I disagree with the federal government. I think it should have been ordered by the federal government. It's a vaccine that has been authorized in Switzerland. Maybe by now it would be only available at the point in time which would be too late. That could be. But if we could have arranged it in a way to have it available right now in Switzerland, we should have. And so that would have been maybe a little somehow different approach to place more orders with an option then to pass them on to other countries. That sounds easier than it probably is because of the very complex also logistical conditions for the handling, for example, of the mRNA vaccines with the deep freeze condition and so on. So I'm not saying this would have been easy, but it's a good excuse for ordering too much because you always can pass it on.
So now we have two questions from the audience. I'd start with Nicola Rodondi.
So thanks very much for the nice talk. I have one question, but just before, I just want in the name of the Research Council of the Swiss National Foundation to thank the politicians who have funded this national research program. Now, my question is, in a crisis, it's also good to see what are the opportunities to improve something. And one problem we discovered in Switzerland that the quality of the healthcare data we have was not so good, that the coordination of the data was not as good as we expect and also are better in other countries. I wonder if it would be an opportunity to improve the share and the quality of the healthcare data in Switzerland, what we saw now with this crisis. For example, if I want to get the data from the insurance, from research, it is very difficult. It is not clear in the law that we could get them. Data from the Federal Office of Statistics are not so easy to get. And all data are collected in different places in Switzerland, are not coordinated. And I think one thing we discover with this crisis is the importance of sharing the data, of the coordination of the data. I don't know who can answer this question, but I think, at least from the politician point of view, I think a better share of the data would improve certainly this crisis, but also perhaps has an issue in the healthcare problems in Switzerland. I don't know if someone wants to take the question, difficult question.
I'm not even sure if to me it's not a question. It's it's just a need that you have phrased. I think that's really one fundamental learning for us to take along out of this crisis. But it will take a huge and controversial debate to arrange to make a new agreement, basically what kind of data I do have to give the authorities in turn for what I then can expect from my authorities. So we are just not in a position nowadays to have these data available. So we can't react as quickly and as efficiently as we should. And people expect us to be efficient and quick, but they are not willing to give us data. And I think this we have to address, and it's fundamental. We see it now with the Covet certificate, and I think it also is a kind of a trade-off. All measures are restricting our freedom. I tend to think that a quarantine is a much tougher infliction than being followed by digital means on my way through everyday life, provided the data is protected. Mm. In other countries, I think in Asia, they see it differently. Well, they don't have a strong data protection, but people, I think, might accept that. And see it as milder restrictions than the quarantine, for example. And we have an open debate here that has hardly started, and that will take much interest, I think, in the upcoming months.
We have another question from Benjamin Meyer. You want to address it?
Yeah, I can also, hang on a second. I can also say it, like read it out. So yeah, I was wondering what the communication approach of the Swiss government is in fighting vaccine hesitancy, but because I really believe that we will be soon coming into a situation which is not obvious now, but where we have much more vaccine available than people actually want to take it. And I think we're really underestimating how big the vaccine hesitancy is in the general population. And I haven't personally, I haven't seen any posters like in the streets where, you know, the people are getting educated about vaccines. I don't watch TV, I have to admit, so I don't know whether there are any, you know, campaigns, ads, like just, you know, 5 minutes before the news, where like a lot of people attend, that just informs about, you know, vaccines, what they do, how they work, what's the safety, how they were developed, you know, what safety is. I mean, everything that makes people trust more in vaccines. I think this is really important if we want to have this vaccine campaign to be a success, and not only just, you know, buying more and more vaccines, because there need to be people who want to take it.
Thank you for the question. Christine Kopp, you want to answer?
Yes, please. Thank you. Very good point. And I agree with you. We have seen that with the onset of the vaccine campaign, the willingness to vaccinate, to get vaccinated myself, has really increased. But as we see in countries like Israel or the United States, that will level off somewhere, and the moment might come soon, as you say. It's a delicate balance. So far, we have hesitated to make broad mass media campaigns on vaccination, because that might also be very counterproductive as long as not everyone has access to the vaccination. It might get cynical to advertise on a billboard, go get vaccinated, while vaccination is not open to you. But we are in the process of, there is information and also advertisement in a smaller scale, internet and so on. And we're in the process of course, planning and rolling out these broader campaigns in the weeks to come, when we really hope that the cantons can vaccinate the entire population or the majority of the population. And we're also in discussion of how we create a broad alliance, how we imply all type of influencers, let's say, like the company where I work, or where I play soccer, where I meet people, to imply all kind of people to carry this message to the population. So more is to come, and of course that will be a major challenge. And I might just add to, I think Samia mentioned it already, we know that also in Switzerland, not only testing, but also the willingness to vaccinate is lower in the lower levels of society. And that's really a major challenge. We have to reach the people who are less prone to follow what the government tells them, who have less access to information. And that's also something we are discussing and trying to find ways. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I take a last question by Annelies Wilder.
I have 1 minute, I see. Thank you. No, I wanted to go back to the, obviously, I think we all agree, as long as there's no equitable access to vaccines, we cannot make vaccines a requirement. Ask me to start a video, all right. And so I totally agree, we cannot make vaccines a requirement for travel. But I think there should be some incentive that also communicates that vaccines actually do work, and that it can be not at least ease some of the requirements. For example, you still have to have a pre-travel PCR test, but you don't need to do quarantine, or you don't need to do a post-arrival PCR, etc. So at least easing some of the restriction for those vaccinated. That's that's also an incentive that Israel used. And by the way, Israel is now at 80% vaccination coverage rates, and as you know, they haven't had any deaths in the past week, and they have now relaxed basically all their public health and social measures, including they stopped the requirement to wear masks. So I think we can learn a lot from Israel, how quickly they did it, and also the communication that they used, but also the incentives that they employed. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you very much. Someone to reply to Mrs. Wilder's statement? If not, I'd like to thank, yeah, Samuel Hurst.
Just a brief comment. This is the whole difference between opening up activities for those who are immunized once you have a vaccine, as opposed to doing it before you have a vaccine. Because an incentive to get the disease is a bad thing, it's a bug, but an incentive to get the vaccine can be a feature.
With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation on this panel, and we have reached the end of the program conference.